I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders, both past, present and future, for they are the memories, the tradition, the culture and the hopes for Aboriginal Australia. We must always remember that under this concrete and stone, this is and always will be traditional Aboriginal land. I would also like to pay my respect to the 5 other different nations across this country of Australia. The nations that represents the oldest continuous culture on earth. Since the beginning of time, the people of this culture lived accordingly to their Creator's laws. For millenniums, few changes occurred. Everyone lived in peace and harmony with themselves, each other, and nature. I like to say that it's a great privilege to be here to speak at one of the big occasions. George Gittoes was like a godfather to me. He raised me when I was a little child. So it's a pleasure, George, and I thank you for inviting me back again. But George said, you need to tell a story, a short story. And I said, well, that's what I'll do. So I'll make it really short. And this is a story from the elders that come from my area, the Budgety people from the Budgety Nation, from southwestern New South Wales, Queensland. So let me start the story. It's not long, and I hope you get something out of it. Our war was ended. There once lived a fierce Budgety warrior named Yulo. All of his people knew him to be the bravest and strongest warrior of his time. His skills with a spear and a boomerang was legendary. Yulo lived during the time of misery and war. All across the world, nations group fought. Blood was shed daily, and people lived in constant fear of attack. The Budgety people lived in underground houses carved from the dirt and protected from the cold by the thick layer of the earth. The smoke from their cooking fires drifted up into the sky. They lived within nature, people of the earth. During this time, roving bands of nations travelled around the earth, destroying many other nations, creating fear and war, oppression, then genocide. Sickness and diseases flood the earth. They stole away the children's and disconnected them from the land. Most of the population were massacred and placed in prisons. So after some time, Warhol had a vision, a very good vision. In his mind, he saw a house in his village in burning ruins. He saw a lake of blood drained from the warriors of his people. Warhol saw the ghost of dead warriors rise up from the grave and do battle with the living. As he watched this vision unfold before him, his brave warrior knew that war cannot be won. No matter how fearless the warrior is, the result of war could only be more suffering. Warhol decided that war must end. The Budgety people were astonished when the greatest warrior announced that he would no longer use his spear and his boomerang to cause death to another person. But they trusted and respected him. The Budgety people put down their weapons and peace came upon the land. How simple was that? What a great message is that for the world? If only we can put the weapons down and make peace. Now their peace is celebrated in dance, in music, in culture and art. So peace did come upon the land. This silent war is still raging within our nations. Australia has an unfinished business. The world has unfinished business. Proper reconciliation and respect to our First Nation people is a start, but what comes next? I believe that we all can make a difference in changing our nation and the world to become a better place for our children. I was talking to Georgia last night in his motel room, and George and I said we must have a plan. Our plan is to build a yellow house on the riverland of outback New South Wales. Here we will work with Indigenous children to reach their full potential and to be creative in many forms of art. The Yellow House will create educational opportunities and benefit for the Indigenous communities. With the support of many people like you and around the world, we believe that this will happen. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming along to the 17th Annual City of Sydney Peace Prize Lecture. My name is David Hirsch. I am the chair of the Sydney Peace Foundation. Thank you to Bruce Shillingsworth for the acknowledgement of country and that wonderful story and those great plans. Thanks also to Uncle Max, who you may have seen out front. Thank you also to the puppeteers who performed for you, and Cameron Bruce on the organ, and Helen Rose, who was singing, and you'll hear more from Helen a little later on in the evening. You will have seen on the screen above you that the Sydney Peace Prize has been awarded to an impressive array of courageous people. Each was selected by the Sydney Peace Prize jury to recognise their significant contributions to the three ideals promoted by the Sydney Peace Foundation: peace with justice, respect for human rights, and the language and practice of non-violence. Winners receive this handsome trophy over here, which is made by Sydney-based glass artist Brian Hurst. The winner also receives a $50,000 prize to further their peace-building projects. It's not all one way, though. They have to work for this. They have to come up here and deliver the City of Sydney Peace Prize lecture. Immediately following tonight's lecture, Sydney's Lord Mayor, Clover Moore, will come up on the stage to present the Peace Prize to this year's winner. Past winners have been recognized for their advocacy for particular causes or peoples or principles. This is the first year that the Peace Foundation has decided to give the award to an artist. We were specifically looking to recognize artists because they tend to see the world differently, and perhaps they're on a different mission than most. Their aim is to touch us on an emotional level. Their objective is transformation of us, and through us, the world. Now, whatever images you may have of artists working quietly in their studio somewhere, they do not apply here. George Gittoes is no ordinary artist. Indeed, he is no ordinary anything. George grew up in 1950s Australia in the cultural and artistic hub of Rockdale. He attended Kogarah High School, and he was creative from a young age, as you will hear. He studied fine arts at the University of Sydney before going to the United States. He was in New York in the 1960s and mixing with avant-garde people like Andy Warhol. Some of you may remember Andy Warhol. He was back in Australia in 1970, where he was a founder of the Yellow House Artists Collective in Potts Point, where he worked together with other artists, including Martin Sharp and Brett Whiteley. His interests ranged from performance puppets, as you've seen, to holograms, to poetry. He paints, he sketches, he takes pictures, and he makes documentary films. For reasons that I expect he will explain to you, he has been drawn to the conflict zones of the world. In many cases, he went there with the Australian Defence Forces, not as a war artist, but as an independent observer and chronicler of what he saw. And he has been witness to some of the worst of mankind. Over the years, he's been to Nicaragua, Somalia, Western Sahara, Cambodia, Mozambique, Sinai, Iraq, Gaza, and Israel. He's been to Bosnia, Papua New Guinea, Northern Ireland, South Africa, Tibet, and Rwanda, something that I imagine he will discuss at greater length. He says that he is an advocate for the innocent victims of conflict. He advocates on their behalf for our attention and our compassion. In 2011, he moved to Afghanistan, where he set up the new Yellow House in Jalalabad, one of the most dangerous cities in the world, and a long way from Rockdale. The new Yellow House is a refuge for Afghan artists. It provides schooling for street kids. It's a community center where men and women can meet and talk and learn together. And he has somehow managed to do all of this with the full knowledge and protection of the Taliban. Among the many accomplishments that George has is he's won the Blake Prize for Religious Art twice. He's won an award for the best documentary and most socially relevant film at a New York Film Festival earlier this year for his movie Love City, Jalalabad. He's also received an Order of Australia medal for his service to the arts. So, be enlightened, be confronted, but above all, be inspired by the winner of the 2015 Sydney Peace Prize, George Gittoes.
Well, I've got to thank David and the Peace Prize. It's wonderful that a thing like this can exist. And Clover Moore and the City of Sydney and everyone, Katie, the two Katies and Juliet, who worked terribly hard on this. It's been fantastic. But I've still got a few little tears trickling down my face. It'll take me a minute to recover from watching not only the puppets but Bruce. Bruce and I, along with his wonderful mother, Ruby, and Auntie Kate, and Uncle Max is Bruce's uncle. He's all of Sydney's uncle, but he is Bruce's uncle, and he's my uncle. Sam, Judy, Millie, and Fala. And the first really important documentary I made, Bruce was my collaborator. We made a film called Tracks of the Rainbow, which back in 1982, I think was the first film the ABC put on TV which showed Aboriginal culture specifically to inspire young people. And it's a special night tonight because Bruce and I, and he's already broken the news, we're announcing that we're going to create a yellow house in Australia. We see these terrible stories about what's happening with school kids in Wilcannia and Brewarrina and all of these places, but they're all artists. We're going to draw them in. We're going to have rock and roll bands coming out of our yellow house on the banks of the Burke River, and we're going to have great painters. And I think about going to Alice Springs in the old days where you'd see people in the riverbed drinking, and now you go there, there's art galleries everywhere, and proud men and women are coming in, artists. And I recently went to Documenta in Germany, and the most beautiful art of all, and you see it everywhere in the world, is the work of the Aboriginal artists. And, you know, you've got to forgive me, I haven't really worked very well on my words for tonight because I became obsessed with making these angels. And right up to the last minute. And thank you. And I mean, there's a lot of great speakers gone before me, and I'm not one of them, but artists love to make things, and the visual is as important as words. And it was important because that's how it all started. As David said, I'm from Rockdale, and Rockdale's always kind of been like the Ellis Island of Australia. It's had wave after wave of immigrants. And when we were kids, it was just the Ledgewoods next door. Jono had been a commander in World War II, and my uncle a sniper, and Dad had been up in the north. And these guys came back, and they didn't want to talk about the war. But all the other families, the migrants, told us terrible stories of suffering. And in those days, Australia was a kind country, not the cruel culture that it's become now. We opened our arms to these people. And so I started doing puppet shows. I don't know where that idea came from. I was just still at Bexley Primary School, and kids came from everywhere, from all different nationalities, and the money went to the Red Cross, and they became so popular. I did puppet shows in scout halls and church halls, and finally the Red Cross contacted me to thank me, and I discovered what the Red Cross was doing all around the world. And I never got over that, just the joy of doing art and knowing that the art could actually help people in their real lives beyond Australia, our lucky country. And the thing about art is that it's free. It's like the sunshine. As soon as they've got electric battery charging stations, Helen and I, we're putting solar power on our roof. We're trying to get an electric car. We want to get away from this whole carbon thing, which just takes away an ancient resource from the land. And creativity is like sunshine. It's free too. But human beings can also destroy. And I know what side I want to be on. I want to be with the creators. Helen and I have just come back from the Yellow House, and in Jalalabad we had to move from the original Yellow House to a new one near a hospital with a security because there's the threat of ISIS there. And it's been the greatest days of our lives because we've seen enormous progress. When we first came to Jalalabad, of course everyone outside, including the Australian Embassy, said it's the most dangerous place on earth and you'll be killed and you can't do it. And in those days, all the big billboards were just metal. People were frightened to put up signs. But progressively, we're now seeing there's signs about women's rights and about how a woman can't be forced into a marriage that she doesn't agree with. And we make films, and we've been lucky enough to see Nihar, the first Afghan Pashtun language-speaking woman to make and direct a feature film on her own. She's making another one now with Amir Shah. They've created a second Yellow House on their own bat. And Helen's doing workshops and for women. And a lot of these women who started years ago are now doing their own radio programs. And there was this electronic billboard in Jalalabad put up by people who wanted to advertise mosque times and tracks from the Quran. And we've got these kids that have made a film, Snow Monkey. We've made a documentary, Snow Monkey, but also a drama. And they wanted to show it to the whole city, so I was a bit mischievous, so I went and rented it. And suddenly it's night, and all the kids are sitting around watching their movie, and the whole city could see it, and the nasties came out, the fundamentalists who hated music and dance and film and everything else. And I just waited for a little while with Cards in the audience. He helped me. And I said, look, these kids, it's about their future. They're Afghan kids. They've made it. It's not made by Americans. It's not made by foreigners. You know the singer. You know the musicians. They probably performed at your weddings. And now, the Taliban and, the most right-wing, regressive people in that city would fight to protect our right to keep those films showing on their billboard. Now, if we'd went in there with guns and AK-47s or anything to, try and force that on those people, we wouldn't have succeeded. But the most moving experience for me recently, Helen and I had to come back to Australia for this basically, but also before that we had to come back briefly to make our editing on our new film, Snow Monkey. And while we're away, my favourite filmmaking kid, Zabi, who wants to be a cameraman, got kidnapped by IS, Islamic State. Now, Zabi wants to be a cameraman with passion. He shot a lot of our film, and in fact, he shot some of the best scenes in the film. He was down the city when a bomb went off in front of Kabul Bank, and body parts were thrown everywhere, and he kept the camera steady, steadier than any war journalist, and captured it. And then afterward he said, that's why I wanted to learn. I wanted to show the world what's being done to us. And so you can imagine how Helen and I felt to get this news. So we rushed back to Jalalabad, and I'm sitting we've moved to a safer place in the kitchen, and suddenly it's like a moment in a beautiful, long novel. I saw this little form pass the windows of the kitchen, and I thought, could that be Zabi? And then he came through the door, and he was so overjoyed to know that he'd escaped that he couldn't speak for about an hour. He was just gagging. He was just thrilled. And while he was with the Taliban, not with the Taliban, with IS, he'd seen terrible, terrible things. He'd seen them kill a baby in front of his own eyes, to punish a village. And so what I feel is that we're teaching kids to use things for communication like cameras, and yet the Australian government and the American government has spent billions and trillions of dollars going over there training boys not much older than Zabi how to use guns and rockets. And so many of them, like is what's happened in Iraq, will end up, because they've only been trained in war and they want to be paid to do war, they'll end up fighting with IS or fighting with the radical Taliban and bringing misery to that country. So we really believe in the Yellow House. And Helen was up there singing, and we both feel lucky to be here tonight because we've had many death threats from, originally we had them from the Taliban, and the Taliban agreed that what we were doing was okay. And now it's from IS. So there were nights when we thought that they'd break down the gates and we would never get back to give this talk and for Helen to sing tonight at the Peace Prize. So thank God we're here. And I think of one particular night where I knew for our film I needed to get interviews with people who'd survived this bombing at the Kabul Bank. But to go back there, it was kind of like an area of death now. So many had been killed there, and IS had sort of claimed it in that part of the city. So I decided, you think sometimes is it worth it just to get some extra truth into a film, to risk your life, to do something like this? And I didn't sleep, I worried all night. I'd set, Zabi to come with me. If we'd been killed, he would have been killed with us, and Amishar, Wakar, all the people I love. And Helen's asleep under the mosquito net, and I looked at her, I thought, will I wake her up? I thought, well, So I went and lifted the net and I gave her a kiss, and she looked up and she said, "Are you doing that?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, you're mad, but I love you, I hope you'll come back." And so we headed out, and just on the road, the weirdest thing, a butcher had skinned a cow or a bullock, and it was there kneeling on a bag on the road, glistening without a skin, like a weird kind of Damien Hirst sort of monster in the city. I thought, this doesn't look good. Then the idea was we were going to interview Anam, who his father had been the police chief, and he'd been killed by IS earlier in an attack on the police station, another bombing. And if anyone could tell us about who'd done this bombing and the history behind it, would be him. So we got down there, and I said to my little group, well, we've got to get in and out. We've got to do this just in a few minutes. It's too dangerous. And we got there, and Anam's not answering his phone. He's not turning up. Half an hour went by, and suddenly men with big beards and paramilitary equipment began appearing and looking at us and getting onto cell phones, and more of them were appearing. And I looked to Amir Shah, who is the brave filmmaker that works with us, and I could see that he wasn't going to say, well, we've got to get out here, IS are going to kill us, because he's a Pashtun and this is his city and he's not going to be intimidated to leave. But he said, George, maybe we should go back to Anam's and see if he's slept in or something, and if we find him we can still come back. But he wasn't at home, and so before we had our yellow house, there's this wonderful guy called Janet who ran a little cafe for artists in the worst of times, when artists were being killed and films were being destroyed, video stores were being blown up. And that's where I'd love to go there, because that's where I'd met the greatest character that we had at the Yellow House, the old Sufi. I'd started I did the Yellow House puppet theatre inspired by Sufism and Islamic art, but I'd never known a real Sufi. And one day I was at Janet's and I heard this harpsichord playing and this ethereal voice, and I went over and I found the old Sufi, and he'd been in hiding until now, because there's nothing the fundamentalists hate more than Sufis, because they believe we all go on our own spiritual journey, and they don't believe in the book, and the fundamentalists believe in the book, the Quran, and every letter of it. So they've been gradually committing a genocide against the Sufis. So he just couldn't stand to be hidden anymore, and he'd come out and say, well, kill me if you like, but I'm like a bird, I've got to sing. So I scooped him up and I took him to the Yellow House, and he became the shaman of the Yellow House, the teacher, and everyone there had been uplifted by his spirit. Most beautiful, ecstatic man I've ever met. He lived in a little tiny tent. He had nothing, but he was richer than any 0.001%er. So I went to the cafe, still with this lovely memory of the old Sufi, and I was thinking about him. And I noticed there was this strangely dressed woman, like something like a fairy tale kind of gypsy creature. And I turned to a car and I said, who is she? And he said, she's a Kuchi. And the Kuchis are the gypsies, and the old Sufi had lived with the gypsies. And then she did something unusual. Women are not allowed into these cafes, but she came in and I saw her talking to Janet, who's also a gypsy, and looking at me. She wouldn't talk to me directly, and suddenly a shiver went down my spine, and I realised the old Sufi was dead. He'd been killed. And we don't know for certain yet, but the rumour is that IS cut his throat and removed his tongue. So I suddenly realised why I'd had this frustrating morning. It was the day that I learnt that my best friend is kind of like a Afghan Uncle Max, had been killed. And I was kind of wired, and I was also hoping to see Shazia, who'd survived the bombing as well. And I thought, as an artist, I've got to deal with this creatively, and we have a drone. And I decided to take it down to the river where these eagles, and see if we could fly the drone next to the eagles and then cut that into our film to represent the departure of the beautiful old Sufi spirit. But when I got down to the river, I went up into a rooftop and looked out, and there, for the first time ever, there weren't any eagles. They come to get the fish out of the river. And then I noticed men with guns. It was Friday, and hunters had decided to come and shoot the eagles. And there was a little beggar boy I knew that was with the hunters, and I think seeing us made these guys feel ashamed of themselves, and they left with their guns. And the kid came up to me, and one of the hunters, instead of giving him some money, had given him a little bird that he'd shot. And he had his hands clutched together, and he was crying because he thought this was such a horrible thing. And then Amir Shah said, "George, we're here, you know, why don't we get some fish and chips and take it back to the Yellow House?" But it takes about 15 or 20 minutes to catch the fish. They have them in tanks and cook them. I just didn't want to sit around waiting for fish to fry, so the little kid was willing to show me a path he'd found down on the river. So I went through a few strange doorways, and I found myself out on the river. And I just wanted to be alone to think about the loss of this Sufi. I mean, we see the Bamiyan Buddhas being blown up by these fundamentalists, but the Sufi was kind of the last of his kind. He knew all the great songs, the great stories. And I thought, I want to lie down on the riverbed and take a picture of the Tora Mountain. He often sang about the Tora Bora Mountains, which are snow-capped all year round. And for him, they were a metaphor for a kind of a spiritual quest to the summit. And so I just lay down at random, and I had my camera, and I wanted to get the river stones. And suddenly, one of the rocks looked back at me. It was like it winked. And I took a few photos, and I couldn't believe my eyes, and I stood up, and this is it. The eye of God. And it was like the old Sufi had reached out to me. And what had happened was, about 10 or 15 years ago, there had been many, many beautiful Buddha statues in the caves on the other side of the river. And the Taliban, and well, not all the Taliban, but the fundamentalists amongst them, had destroyed these 2,500-year-old Buddhas and pushed the broken bits of sculpture into the river. And here it was, the eye of God I'd found in the river. And I thought, this is the era we're living in, where there are elements like IS who are taking us backwards. They're destroying Nineveh, my favourite place, Assyrian art in Iraq. And these ancient Buddhas which had survived so long. And so I came back, and my phone was buzzing in my pocket, and it was Shazi, and it was like the old Buddha had reached out to me, and suddenly this curse had been broken, and Shazi was happy to talk to me about the bomb. So I went back to the Yellow House. She was there. Shazi is the girlfriend of the gangster she's 11 and he's 11, and he's the gangster that half runs Jalalabad. He's got a razor gang, and she wants to reform him. She wants to make him become a doctor or a lawyer or something. Anyway, I got there, and I told her the sad news of the old Sufi, and she said, the only thing that's helped me survive witnessing this terrible thing, this bombing, was the stories and the songs of the old Sufi. They've been going over and over and over in my mind. But I'm an optimist. I believe that we're going to succeed in Jalalabad. I mean, tonight I've just been on the drum, and people look at me and say, "Oh, it's looking so bad in Afghanistan, everywhere else in the Middle East. Georgia just can't succeed." But I've been working this long that I can remember, for example, South Africa and Terre Blanche, these neo-Nazis with a three-hooked swastika, and the young boys, their children being forced to wear. It was like going to a rally at Kruger Farm. It was like going back in a time machine to the early days of the Nazis. And at one point, Terre Blanche's brother came down to me and asked for my camera. I refused to give it to him. He took out his handgun and smashed it in my hand, and then went to headbutt me. But I'm a Rockdale boy, and I got in first and spread his face across, his nose across his face. It was on South African television, and a lot of people, including Mandela, said, "Well, that's great. It's the first time we've seen blood on the faces of these monsters." But that darkness went, and I was invited to be at the greatest day of my life in Pretoria when Nelson Mandela had been elected, and it was his inauguration. And I don't wear a suit very often. I haven't got a tie on tonight. It's been pretty hard to get me to put this coat on, but for Mandela I went out and bought a suit, and I had a tie, and I was going to be able to sit down with the Duke of Edinburgh and Al Gore and Fidel Castro and Yasser Arafat. All these people came for Mandela. But I looked out and I just couldn't resist. I knew that once I went through the turnstile and out to be with the people, I would never be able to get back. And I did it. I went out there, and here I was, this idiot, sunburnt and funny suit, and all my cameras around my neck. And this beautiful old couple, Elizabeth and Joseph, came up to me, and they thought I was a wedding photographer. And they said, "This is the greatest day of our lives since we got married." They were about the same age as Mandela, and they asked me if I could do a photograph. And I said, I can do some Polaroids now and you can have them, but I'm not really a photographer, I'm an artist. I'd love to draw you. And Elizabeth said, "Well, if you're going to draw me, I want to be kissing the man I love on this great day." So she began to kiss, and I said, but Elizabeth, it's going to take me 15 minutes to do this drawing. She turned around and said, "I don't care," and went back to the kiss. And this was Africa, so suddenly I had 200 people gathered around me, and they began singing and dancing and celebrating this long kiss. And so when I finished, I showed it to Elizabeth, and she said, "I have to have it." And I said, "Well, I have to have one too." And so she said, "All right, well, I'll kiss him again." And everyone cheered. And so we did the second long-awaited kiss of freedom. And I've got the drawing now. But, you know, then I can remember Cambodia. I was there under the Khmer Rouge. Australia should be very proud. General John Sanderson and our government helped bring about the first democratic elections there. But I was there before that, in the time of the Khmer Rouge. And I'd walk along, and there was always this guy that was grinning from ear to ear. He was just the happiest man. I couldn't understand why he was so happy. He was fixing bikes. And in fact, he even fixed my bike. But one day I came along, and he'd have his tools in a bag over his lap, and he'd taken it off, and I realised he'd lost both of his legs right up to his hip in that conflict. And he then saw what I'd seen, and he said, "I don't care." And he jumped up and he made himself a three-wheel bike that he could pedal with his hands, and he just rode around and round at me, laughing at me like the Australian fool who thought that legs were going to hold him back. Anyway, after the election, a few years later, I came back to see where he was, and he was now very proudly the owner of a motorbike repair spot. And he said, "Well, George, I might have lost the legs, but I didn't lose everything." And here he was with his newborn baby and had a few kids, and incredibly proud man. And then we were chatting, and he said, "You know, legs only get in the way if you've got a motorbike repair business. You know, I can get right into them. I can get into parts that you could never reach if you're a man with legs." And it's people like him that give me so much optimism. Then I think about Bosnia. I mean, I've got so many sad stories to tell about Bosnia, but recently Singapore Airlines have sponsored me to come back from Afghanistan, God bless them. The only time Helen and I have ever travelled business class. And we were sitting there with our glass of champagne in our hand, and I opened the flight, magazine, and here's a beautiful picture of the Mostar Bridge. And it's an ancient bridge created, medieval times by a student of Sinan, where the Muslim, and then the most sophisticated technicians of the world, were meeting the people coming down, much more barbaric people coming down from Russia. And I remember when Serb and Croatian artillery destroyed that bridge and fell into the river. And I went down, and everyone was digging, and there was a girl. They could hear a girl making noises, and she'd been under the rubble for days, and the rest of her family had been killed. And they were making a particular effort because she was the great piano player, great potential pianist of Mostar. And they got her out, and being down there with the dead bodies of the family had sent her completely insane. And I was given the job of getting her back. There were mental asylums everywhere in Sarajevo for children who'd been driven insane by the war. And I just didn't like leaving there, so I went out. You couldn't take it there, but I bought a piano accordion, a beautiful silver pearly one. And then every time I'd go past this little orphanage for the insane children, I'd hear her playing. And gradually the music repaired her, and it repaired many of the children. And now Sarajevo, like in the brochure didn't even mention that there'd ever been a war there, or that the bridge had ever been damaged. I've had a bit of a sort of inner conflict with giving this talk, in that as soon as it was announced that I'd being awarded the Peace Prize, I had all my many friends in the Jewish community contact me and say, "George, don't talk about Palestine." And then I've had a huge amount of other people saying, "The biggest problem for peace in the world is Palestine. You've got to talk about it." And for me, the most poignant story that I've got about Palestine is to do with this cup. There's a little ceramics factory in Hebron, and my mother was a ceramicist, and I loved this kind of design. And I always go there. I love tea as well, so I like to have a good supply of these tea mugs. One day I was down there. It was Ramadan, and it was also Purim, the religious time for the Jewish community. And there's a very old mosque there, the Mosque of Abraham, and it's divided between Jews and Muslims. And I'm friends with a family there, the Jabari family, and friends with them because the father was a great human rights lawyer who believed that through the rule of law, peace could be brought to Palestine and Israel, and he disagreed with the PLO and Hamas. He was a wonderful, moderate humanist. And so I was at the factory and I heard gunfire, and I looked up and there was smoke coming from the Hebron Mosque. And when I got near there, you couldn't get right up to it because the Israeli army was all around it. I found little Mohath, and he's a kid about 13 years old. He was Abed's son, the lawyer's son. And he'd been crying so much it looked like he had scratches down his face. His tears had almost made rivers down his cheeks. And he told me that this man, Baruch Goldstein, had come in and opened fire on the people praying in the mosque. He'd been there a few months earlier and thrown acid on the people. And this guy, Abed the father, saw the muzzle of the gun turning to him, and he put himself in the way of his child. But his other child, Salman, was killed, and his brother was killed as well. And the little boy had felt the bullets hitting his father, and he'd become covered in blood. I just didn't know what to do, so I did what I often do. I started drawing him. And at that moment, the only thing I had to give him, and I went to the funeral of his father, was a Swiss Army knife, you know, the ones with everything on it, the scissors, and for a little while that distracted him, but I decided I'd be like a godfather to him. I'd keep coming back. The next time I came back, you have to go in through the back of the Jabari house because there's sniper fire from the Jewish settlement. I found that Mrs. Jabari wasn't there, and she was in hospital. And I went around the hospital, and she had a broken arm, a broken leg, her ribs were cracked. And I said, "What happened?" And she'd seen a Jewish settler woman who'd come into the Palestinian area, and she had a pram and another little toddler. She had 2 kids. Mrs. Jabari went down there, and she walked this distraught woman up into the settlement. But when they got to the door of her home, the woman got her children inside. She was probably totally traumatised, and she shut the door, leaving Mrs. Jabari outside. Then settlers surrounded Mrs. Jabari and kicked her and punched her and beat her until she had, these breaks in her body. And someone got her to the hospital where I saw her. So I looked into her face, and I think it's someone I've never, she's suffered so much. And I said, now if you saw another Jewish person in the street who was in distress like that, would you go and help them again? And she looked at me and she said, I've lost my husband and my son, but no one can take my humanity. Now, I've just entered my film in the Jerusalem Film Festival. Fingers crossed it'll be shown. I love Israel, and the agent from all of my films now is Israeli-based company in Tel Aviv. And I'll be telling stories like this in a few weeks in Jerusalem. And what I know is that this guy, this shooter that went to the mosque, he was actually a doctor, he was educated, he was from Brooklyn, but he'd never treat Muslims or Druze or Christians. He was a downright crazy racist like Monis, who went into the Lint Cafe in Australia. And I've got I believe in Israel, I believe in that dream, but there will never be peace while there are nutcases like the Hamas, people who are firing rockets into Israel, and while there are people in Israel who are racist and hate like Goldstein hated. And so what I want to see, and I dream of peace in Israel, is that all the good people of both Israel and Palestine will turn against these people and no longer listen to them. And I believe that we will see peace in our time. The hardest experience for me, as David mentioned earlier, was Rwanda. I was at Kibeho, where thousands of people had come to a refugee camp. And, sorry, not a refugee. They'd come there because it was a church, it was a cathedral. And there'd been visions of the Virgin Mary there, and they felt that they would be protected by this holy place. In fact, by coming together, they just gave an opportunity for them to be slaughtered. And I was there with a small group of Australian soldiers. I think there's a couple of them in the audience tonight, particularly a lady. And they're far braver than me, and the heroics that they showed to save lives there were absolutely, unbelievable. Greatest acts of courage I've seen in my life. And so if you're an artist in a situation like that, you're seen as like a ghoul if you go around taking photographs and doing drawings when you could be helping to get people to the doctors. And at one point I saw this woman, her name was Immaculée, and she was probably only 15 or 16 years old. Her face is covered in blood, her face had been slashed, her head had been hit with a machete which had gone right through the skull. And she couldn't live, but I just couldn't imagine, living with wounds like that. And the Australian Army doctor looked at me and said, George, why don't you just stop for a minute and go and sit with her so that she doesn't die on her own? And so I took out my pencil and paper and I began drawing her, and that's become the most important drawing in my life. It's called Eyewitness. And Immaculée said, but why are you drawing me? And I said, because I want the world to know what was done to you. And she was just barely clinging to life. She was like a neon bulb that's on the blink. Life was flicking on and off. But she fought to keep her consciousness until I'd finished the drawing. And I turned it around, and for a second she was stunned, like she saw herself as beautiful, and she was beautiful, but here's this wretched drawing of her chopped up face. And then she says, yes, keep your promise. I want the world to see this. And it's been on the cover of my books. I did about 6 or 7 or 8 versions of that painting. It's been all around the world, and I've kept my promise to Immaculée. But the problem I find is that people don't tell this kind of story, and you know, these situations and these people are dehumanised. So my job is really, like we have with the new film, to bring you close to them, to let you know those stories. I don't understand the big picture, I'm not a political scientist, but just to bring people like the preacher also from Rwanda to you. The most moving experience I had in Iraq, I decided that I had to go to Iraq. I knew that the war was coming, and I knew that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, that it was I don't know why America went in there. All the troubles we're seeing now are because of that illegal and crazy intervention. I can't understand why the world doesn't take out sanctions against America. They'll do it against Russia or South Africa, but never against America. And the city of Baghdad under Saddam, he was a dictator that tortured people and used chemical warfares and things like this, but the country was together. There was good universities where women could get educated, and roads and buildings, and there were even big art exhibitions. So when I knew the Americans were coming to the city, the word got out that Saddam had escaped. He'd left the building. And I thought, I want to go to Abu Ghraib, this notorious prison where he's tortured and killed so many people. And when I got there, it was just so eerie. It was like something out of medieval horror. You know, there were people dragging bits of this terrible prison away with them, and the gates had been pulled down, and I could hear the American tanks just coming into the city, but it was a no man's land, not a very safe place to be. And I went straight to the gallows, and there were lists on the wall, and Saddam, even though he knew that he was going to be deposed, still gave the order for all of these political prisoners in Abu Ghraib to be hung. And I went to the top of the gallows, and the first noose that I picked up, I noticed that part of the executioner's art was to put tissue around the noose so that they wouldn't feel the coarseness of the rope on their neck. It was a little bit of kindness. But when the rope was pulled tight and the trapdoor was open, perspiration and skin would end up on the tissue and on the noose, and they used a new noose for each person. And I'd figured out where the dead bodies were, but it was horrible because dogs had gotten to them. They were in shallow graves. So the relatives came in, and they're all beautiful, educated people. These people that have been killed were educated, enemies of middle-class people of Saddam Hussein. And they'd been so used to someone giving them orders, they said, "George, we've got to bury something of our relative," when they realised they'd been killed. And they looked at the nooses, and they saw the sweat and the skin on the nooses. And they said, "Do you think it'd be all right if we took the nooses and we buried the nooses?" They knew which ones had belonged to their relatives. And of course, it wasn't my decision, but I said, yes, take them by all means. And as they were leaving, they all said to me, if the Americans come in and, they're on the outskirts of the city and they close down these places, we will welcome them and we'll think that it was a good thing. But what did the Americans do? They just kept all these prisons, and they filled them a lot of them were very innocent people. And we've seen the scenes of indignity and torture that went on, the Americans perpetrated at Abu Ghraib and all of these other places. So what I realised is the huge problem that we have now with Baghdadi is that he was in that prison, and he used the people that were there to become his recruits. And so this became a training ground. Under Saddam, none of these things had ever happened. So my friend Meredith is down in the audience. She's just put up the 5-minute sign, so I've got to wind up my talk. I can tell stories until the cows come in. Anyway, for me, it all, people look at me and they say, well, aren't you tortured? Can't you sleep at night? And I say, well, look at my face. I'm the happiest person you'll ever see because I've lived this life of helping people and fulfilling my creative dreams. But But after the Yellow House, I'd done the puppets at Rockdale, the original Yellow House. I thought, well, we're just really creating entertainment for, this is the hippie era, for hippie, I've never taken drugs, to come in and take heroin, and, sorry, not heroin, heroin and LSD and all these things, shoot up and trip out on the art that we'd done. I was very disillusioned, I was conflicted, and Malcolm Muggeridge's book had come out about Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I read it, and just out of the blue I sent her a letter, and amazed when this little fragile, envelope came back in the hand of the great Mother Teresa, and she said, "George, if God's given you these talents, you should use them, but if you use them for others, you'll be a very happy old man." So I'm 66 years old, and I've followed Mother Teresa's lead to the limit. And you're looking at a very, very happy person, particularly happy tonight for receiving this prize. So thank you all very, very much.
So, George, come back. I want to say how pleased I am that you're here tonight in our town hall, the People's Place, and what an extraordinary honour it has been for us to hear George Gittoes speak. I too want to acknowledge the original custodians of our land, the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and acknowledge the people of the 200 nationalities who live in our city. The City of Sydney has been a proud supporter of the Peace Prize since 1989. David has told you about the history of the prize. I don't want to say anything very much more. I think we must all be so incredibly inspired by George Gittoes and his wonderful creativity and his wonderful art, and his wonderful example to us about being such a contributing human being, using his art and his creativity to help us understand the world that we're living in, and how proud we can be of him as an Australian, and the great inspiration of how he as an individual has gone out into all those different places in the world and played such an important role, and using his creativity and being such a joyous person, and coming here and talking to us in an inspired way about hope and the human spirit. So it is a very great honour for me as the Lord Mayor of Sydney to present you with the 2015 Peace Prize, George Gittoes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Oh, I know that old Claude and Joyce Gittoes, we've got a couple of empty seats down there. My mum and dad are in the audience tonight, and I've got a tremendous amount of friends, including, of course, Helen, who I love, and my daughter Naomi, and there's so many out there. So thank you all. And when I got my PhD, I was supposed to go and I think bow or something to the Vice-Chancellor, or not my doctorate or whatever it is. And I just held it up like that, like Rocky Balboa for the for the students. So there it is, the Peace Prize. It's wonderful that these things exist. They have the VCs made out of an old cannon, a piece of cannon for the soldiers, but this is the one prize in Australia for people who are not going out with guns and rockets. But yeah, thank you very much, Sydney.